Imagine looking at a tiny piece of cork and seeing a world no human being had ever described before. It was only a small piece of material. But through a strange instrument of glass and brass, it became a landscape of empty chambers. Robert Hooke stared through the microscope and saw something that looked like the rooms of a monastery. He had no idea that one simple observation would give science a word it still uses today. Cells. The story began in 17th century England, during a time when science was changing fast. Old ideas were being questioned. Telescopes were revealing new worlds in the sky. Experiments were challenging ancient beliefs about nature. And Robert Hooke wanted to see what was hidden. He was born in 1635 on the Isle of Wight. His father, John Hooke, was a clergyman. The family did not have great wealth, and Robert's childhood was not easy. From an early age, however, he showed a strong interest in making things. He could draw. He could build. He could take objects apart and try to understand how they worked. He was fascinated by clocks, machines, tools, and mechanical systems. While other children might have looked at an object and simply accepted it, Hooke wanted to know what was inside. Why did it move? What made it work? Could he build a better version? These questions stayed with him. After his father's death, Hooke went to Westminster School in London. There he studied subjects that would shape his future, including mathematics and classical learning. But his greatest talent was practical. He was good with his hands. He could design instruments and understand complicated mechanical problems. This skill eventually brought him into contact with important scientists. One of them was Robert Boyle. Boyle was already known for his experiments with air and gases. He needed someone who could build and operate delicate scientific equipment. Hooke was exactly the kind of person he needed. The two began working together. In Boyle's laboratory, Hooke helped develop and operate an improved air pump. The machine allowed scientists to remove much of the air from a sealed chamber and then observe what happened. This was difficult work. The equipment had to be carefully made. Seals had to hold. Valves had to work. Glass could break. Experiments could fail. But Hooke was patient. He understood that good science depended not only on ideas but also on instruments that could make those ideas testable. Soon, his reputation grew. In 1662, Hooke became the first curator of experiments of the Royal Society, one of England's leading scientific institutions. His job was demanding. He had to prepare experiments for meetings and demonstrations. He had to show other scientists what could be observed, measured, and tested. Week after week, Hooke experimented. He studied air. He studied movement. He studied light. He studied heat. He examined plants, insects, feathers, minerals, and tiny pieces of matter. And then there was the microscope. Microscopes had existed before Hooke, but improvements in lenses and instrument design were allowing scientists to see much smaller objects than ever before. For Hooke, this was more than a useful tool. It was a new way of looking at nature. The telescope had opened the heavens. The microscope could open the world beneath our eyes. Hooke began making careful observations through his microscope. He did not simply look and move on. He drew what he saw. He wanted other people to see it too. That was important because scientific communication in the 17th century depended heavily on drawings and written descriptions. Photography did not exist. There were no digital cameras. No computer screens. No simple way to capture an image. If Hooke wanted to show another scientist what he had discovered, he had to draw it. And he was very good at drawing. He spent long hours examining tiny structures and creating detailed illustrations. In 1665, he published his famous book, Micrographia. The book changed the way many people thought about the natural world. Its pages contained large, detailed illustrations of things that were normally invisible to the naked eye. A flea appeared enormous. A louse became a strange armored creature. A fly seemed almost like a monster. Plant structures became landscapes. Readers could suddenly see familiar objects in a completely different way. And then came the cork. Hooke took a thin slice of cork and placed it under his microscope. He adjusted the instrument. He looked again. The cork was not a solid, featureless substance. Instead, it appeared to be made of many tiny compartments. They looked like small rooms. Hooke compared them to the small rooms occupied by monks. He called them cells. What Hooke saw were the walls of dead plant cells in the cork. He did not yet understand the full biological meaning of cells. That understanding would come much later. But the word remained. And centuries afterward, cell became one of the most important ideas in biology. Every living organism is made from cells or structures derived from cells. The tiny compartments Hooke saw were the beginning of a much larger story. But Hooke's curiosity did not stop with biology. He wanted to understand almost everything. He investigated the structure of materials. He studied fossils. He examined insects. He looked at crystals. He explored the behavior of springs. And one of his most important discoveries came from something much larger than a microscope. It came from movement. Hooke was interested in mechanics. He wanted to understand how objects behaved when forces acted on them. He experimented with springs. If you pull a spring, it stretches. Pull it harder, and it stretches farther. Hooke discovered a relationship between the force applied to a spring and how much it stretches, within the spring's elastic limit. This became known as Hooke's law. The idea seems simple today. But simple ideas can be powerful. Hooke was showing that nature could be described mathematically. Instead of simply saying, the spring stretches when I pull it, scientists could measure the force and the change in length and find a predictable relationship. This way of thinking became central to physics and engineering. But Hooke's life was not limited to laboratories. In 1666, disaster struck London. The Great Fire of London destroyed a huge part of the city. Thousands of buildings were damaged or destroyed. London had to be rebuilt. And Hooke became deeply involved. Working with other surveyors and officials, he helped measure property boundaries and plan parts of the rebuilding process. He also worked as an architect. Hooke designed buildings and worked on major construction projects. His scientific mind and practical skills made him useful in a city that needed to be rebuilt. This was another unusual part of his life. He was not only a scientist. He was an inventor, experimenter, architect, surveyor, artist, and instrument maker. He moved between different fields because he did not see strict walls between them. To Hooke, understanding nature meant observing it from many directions. His microscope showed him tiny worlds. His instruments helped him measure physical forces. His architectural work dealt with structures on a human scale. His astronomical observations took him in the opposite direction, toward the enormous scale of the universe. He used telescopes to observe the moon and other celestial objects. He studied the surface of the moon and made detailed drawings. He observed stars. He examined the movements of planets. And he wondered about the forces that governed the heavens. In the 17th century, astronomy was changing rapidly. Galileo had used the telescope to challenge old ideas about the universe. Kepler had described the motion of planets. Newton was developing a mathematical theory of gravity. Hooke was part of this same scientific world. He became interested in the idea that gravity might operate according to an inverse square relationship. His work and correspondence with other scientists became part of the wider discussion that eventually surrounded Newton's theory of universal gravitation. But Hooke's relationship with Newton became difficult. Both men were brilliant. Both were ambitious. And both believed strongly in their own work. They disagreed over scientific ideas and over who deserved credit for certain discoveries. Their conflict became one of the famous rivalries in the history of science. Hooke's reputation suffered after his death, partly because many of his papers and records were lost, and partly because Newton later became an overwhelmingly famous figure. For a long time, Hooke was remembered less than he deserved. But his contributions were everywhere. In microscopy, in physics, in astronomy, in architecture, in scientific instruments, in the study of fossils and materials, and in the language of biology. There was another side to Hooke's work that was especially important. He believed that observation mattered. Nature did not have to agree with an old book. It had to be tested. If an experiment showed something unexpected, the scientist had to pay attention. That attitude was central to the emerging scientific culture of his time. And it is one reason his microscope work remains so important. Imagine that laboratory again. A small piece of cork lies on a table. The room is quiet. The microscope stands nearby. Hooke leans toward the eyepiece. He sees a pattern of tiny chambers. He sketches them. He studies them. He gives them a name. He cannot know what the discovery will eventually mean. He cannot see modern hospitals. He cannot see DNA. He cannot see genetic sequencing. He cannot see scientists watching living cells divide under powerful microscopes. He cannot see astronauts carrying biological experiments into space. He cannot see modern medicine using knowledge of cells to understand cancer, infection, and disease. He only sees what is in front of him. And that is enough. Because science often begins this way. Not with a grand answer. With a careful observation. Hooke died in 1703. By then, he had spent decades investigating the natural world. He had helped build scientific instruments. He had performed countless experiments. He had published Micrographia. He had helped rebuild London. He had studied the heavens. And he had given the microscopic world a name that would survive for centuries. His story is especially interesting because he did not fit neatly into one category. He was not simply a biologist. He was not simply a physicist. He was not simply an architect. He was a person who wanted to understand how things worked. That curiosity connected everything he did. When he looked through a microscope, he wanted to know what was hidden. When he studied a spring, he wanted to know why it behaved as it did. When he watched the moon, he wanted to understand its surface. When he designed a building, he wanted to know how its structure could stand. The same question was always there. How does this work? Centuries later, the tools have changed. Microscopes can now see structures far smaller than anything Hooke could imagine. Scientists can watch individual molecules. They can edit genes. They can grow cells in laboratories. They can study the machinery inside living organisms. But the basic act remains familiar. Look closely. Notice something unusual. Ask a question. Test it. Record what you find. Then ask another question. That is the real legacy of Robert Hooke. He did not discover the entire microscopic world. He opened a window into it. And once that window was opened, it could never be closed again. The tiny rooms he saw in Cork became part of the language of modern biology. The instruments he helped develop became part of a growing culture of experimental science. His drawings showed ordinary people that the world contained things they had never seen. A flea was no longer just a tiny insect. A piece of cork was no longer just a piece of cork. The world had hidden layers. And Hooke had found a way to reveal them. Perhaps that is why his story still matters. Not because he had every answer. He did not. Not because every idea he proposed was correct. It wasn't. His importance came from something simpler. He was willing to look. He was willing to build the tools needed to look more closely. And when the world showed him something strange, He did not look away. He drew it. He studied it. He gave it a name. Then he showed it to everyone. And through that small act of curiosity, Robert Hooke helped humanity see a world that had always been there but had been invisible until someone finally looked.